Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a moral and strategic autopsy of the Helghast. You know them, you love to hate them, but they are arguably one of the most compelling and tragic factions in gaming history. Why? Because they actually had a very real, undeniable grievance against their oppressors. But, as we're gonna see, a legitimate grievance doesn't hand you a blank check to commit atrocities. Let's trace exactly how the victims of a terrible wrong systematically transformed themselves into the literal monsters they despised.
To really understand the Helghast, we have to plunge right into the philosophical tension beating at the heart of their story. A real injury does not erase the line between a war of liberation and a war of domination. That right there, that's the crux of the whole conflict. It forces us to confront justice versus revenge. As we move through this explainer, you'll see a very deliberate tragic transition. We're going to start out with some deep sympathy for a wronged people, but eventually we're going to be forced to condemn the horrific path they ultimately chose to walk down.
That iconic glowing red gaze and the heavy respiratory gear they wear, it's not just some intimidating badass uniform. It's actually a symbol of legitimate grievance and bare-bones survival. Remember, the Helghast began their story as pure victims. They're the descendants of human colonists exiled from Earth, just abandoned on the incredibly hostile world of Helgen, a planet where literally just breathing the air without industrial filtration was a death sentence. They endured unimaginable environmental catastrophes, gravity sickness, brutal forced labor, all just to survive. But the absolute worst crime committed against them was by the Interplanetary Strategic Alliance, the ISA, who orchestrated the devastating destruction of Helghast cities from orbit. Seriously, no reasonable reading of this history excuses what was done to them. Their grievance was 100% real, and their anger was completely earned.
But here is where the narrative takes a really sharp pivot. Audarch scholar Vasari's response to that horrific history wasn't a pursuit of justice. It wasn't a fight for liberation. It was a hunger for expansion. There's a stark distinction we need to make here. A war of liberation targets the structures of oppression to gain freedom. A war of domination targets the innocent to build an empire. Vasari launched a completely unprovoked invasion of Vecta, kicking off the primary conflict of the franchise. He targeted civilians who had absolutely nothing to do with the orbital bombardment of Helgen. Basically, the Helghast took their completely justifiable anger and weaponized it into a totally unjustifiable response. That shift played out in brutal reality as the Helghast war machine descended into Vectan streets. Look, this isn't a defense force, right? This is an army of conquest. The invasion of Vecta proves, without a shadow of a doubt, that the Helghast deliberately crossed the line. They were no longer seeking justice for the orbital bombings. They were actively building an empire of domination. They stepped way over the boundary of self-defense and became the aggressors, starting a brutal war against people who were completely innocent of the historical crimes committed against Helgen. This massive shift leads us to what's honestly the most heartbreaking aspect of the entire Helghast story, the tragedy of imitation. Think about it. Because they were ruthlessly bombed from orbit by the ISA, what did they do the second they gained power? They decided to bomb others. They were once victims of this massive, unfeeling military machine, and yet they chose to rebuild that exact same machinery of hatred, only this time they were sitting at the controls. To be wronged is a tragic part of the human experience, but to deliberately reconstruct the apparatus of your own oppression to use against someone else, well, that's a choice. And by making that choice, they completely forfeited the moral high ground that their immense suffering had originally earned them. And that imitation extended into some of the absolute darkest corners of prejudice. The regime manufactured a cult of racial and national superiority. Historically, the Helghast had been dehumanized by Earth and the ISA, labeled as Helghast scum. But instead of breaking that cycle, they just mirrored it. They turned their venom toward the VC, Vectans of Helghast descent. Vasari's regime literally branded these people as traitors and subhumans, pulling from the exact same playbook of prejudice that had been used to marginalize the Helghast in the very first place. So this toxic ideology didn't just stay in the realm of propaganda, it manifested into horrific, calculated action. The source material brings us to this incredibly chilling reality, the Petrus Initiative, a program of mass extermination. Just let those words sink in for a second. This was a deliberate initiative aimed at entirely erasing Vectan populations. At this point, we're no longer talking about military maneuvers, supply lines, or territorial disputes. This makes it absolutely crystal clear that this was an outright atrocity. Their historical grievance had just become this twisted alibi for full-blown genocide. The evidence of these crimes is just staggering. Brutalist weaponry and the horrifying deployment of toxic gas became standard tactics for them. The Helghast willingly utilized forbidden chemical agents right on the battlefield. Now, the lore emphasizes that these actions weren't just grim tactical necessities, they were unadulterated crimes. Whatever the sins of the ISA were, and yeah, they were vast, deliberately targeting civilian populations with weapons of mass terror crosses the clearest possible moral line in any conflict. The Helghast didn't just cross that line, they pretty much sprinted past it over and over again. How does a whole society get to this point? Well, it requires total, uncompromising control. Autarch Scholar Visari maintained his grip through a very calculated formula: fear, propaganda, a personality cult, and endless war. It is a classic hallmark of tyranny, isn't it? Manufacturing permanent conflict just to survive. The dossier actually points out a brilliant strategic insight here. This totalitarianism wasn't actually a sign of strength. It was a sign of immense fragility. Any scarcity was blamed on external enemies, and any internal dissent was immediately stamped out and labeled as treason. An endless war was required to justify his endless control over the populace. And who ended up paying the ultimate price for that endless control? The very people Visari claimed to be elevating. Visari completely betrayed his own people. Ordinary Helghast soldiers, many of whom were simply conscripts who just wanted to survive the harsh reality of their poisoned world, were sacrificed, all to feed Visari's massive ego. A leadership that treats its own citizens as disposable cannon fodder to uphold some glorious myth, they aren't protecting their people, they're using them. The Helghast people essentially became victims twice, first by the ISA, and second by their own autarch. All of this tension naturally built to a catastrophic strategic climax. Having completely failed to win their war of domination politically, and having thoroughly lost it morally, the Helghast leadership decided to double down. They gambled absolutely everything on the Petrus Initiative, a literal weapon of total annihilation. It was the ultimate desperate roll of the dice by a regime that had boxed itself into a corner of permanent, unwinnable conflict. And spoiler alerts, they lost that gamble. The retaliation they faced was apocalyptic. In seeking to end the Vectans, the Helghast engineered their own annihilation. Helgen itself was totally devastated, its cities violently reduced to glass and ash, and its surviving population scattered. The source text perfectly captures this grim reality. They won the argument about who was hurt, but they lost everything else. It really proves that no grievance, no matter how profoundly real or historically validated, can survive the cold, unforgiving logic of mutual destruction.
Which brings us to the deepest tragedy noted in the entire explainer. None of this had to happen. Their ultimate goals were actually achievable by other means. A winnable peace was literally on the table. Recognition of Helgan's suffering, reparations for the terrible orbital bombardments they endured, and a stable political settlement with Vecta were all entirely possible. But Autarch Visari, he rejected cooperation. He chose the dangerous romance of empire and conquest instead. He traded a winnable, prosperous peace for an unwinnable, devastating war, and he dragged his entire world down with him.
This perfectly sums up the dual truth of the entire franchise. Sympathy is not absolution. It's entirely right and honestly necessary to mourn the Helghast as victims of Earth and the ISA. Their suffering was profound. But it is equally right to condemn them as perpetrators of monstrous atrocities. The sheer genius of the lore is that it demands we hold both of these conflicting truths in our minds at the exact same time. They were wrong not because their initial pain was fake, but because the massive, towering body count they created at the end was entirely their own doing. A just cause, when corrupted by profoundly unjust means, simply becomes another tragedy.
Let the weight of their choices really sink in for a moment. Those glowing red eyes aren't the gaze of a survivor asking for justice anymore. This is the menacing reality of what the Helghast deliberately chose to become. They stared directly into the abyss of their own suffering, and they decided to unleash that abyss onto the rest of the galaxy. And that leaves us with one lingering, provocative question to reflect on. As you look at the metamorphosis of Killzone's most sympathetic victims, ask yourself, when you answer your own pain with domination and atrocity, are you still a survivor fighting for liberation, or have you just become the very next oppressor? Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Catch you in the next one.